I would rather court the yoke than shun it. I have broken hearts before now, and I am very sorry for it, for it's a terrible thing to reflect upon.' 'It is indeed,' said Miss Snevellicci. 'Now, Led, my dear, we must positively get her ready, or we shall be too late, we shall indeed.' This pious reasoning, and perhaps the fear of being too late, supported the bride through the ceremony of robing, after which strong tea and brandy were administered in alternate doses as a means of strengthening her feeble limbs and causing her to walk steadier. 'How do you feel now, my love?' inquired Miss Snevellicci. 'Oh, Lillyvick!' cried the bride, 'if you knew what I am undergoing for you!' 'Of course he knows it, love, and will never forget it,' said Miss Ledrook. 'Do you think he won't?' cried Miss Petowker, really showing great capability for the stage. 'Oh, do you think he won't? Do you think Lillyvick will always remember it? Always, always, always?' There is no knowing in what this burst of feeling might have ended, if Miss Snevellicci had not at that moment proclaimed the arrival of the fly, which so astounded the bride that she shook off divers alarming symptoms which were coming on very strong, and running to the glass adjusted her dress, and calmly declared that she was ready for the sacrifice. She was accordingly supported into the coach, and there kept up, as Miss Snevellicci said, with perpetual sniffs of sal volatile, and sips of brandy, and other gentle stimulants, until they reached the manager's door, which was already opened by the two Master Crummleses, who wore white cockades, and were decorated with the choicest and most resplendent waistcoats in the theatrical wardrobe. By the combined exertions of these young gentlemen and the bridesmaids, assisted by the coachman, Miss Petowker was at length supported in a condition of much exhaustion to the first floor, where she no sooner encountered the youthful bridegroom than she fainted with great decorum. 'Henrietta Petowker,' said the collector, 'cheer up, my lovely one.' Miss Petowker grasped the collector's hand, but emotion choked her utterance. 'Is the sight of me so dreadful, Henrietta Petowker?' said the collector. 'Oh no, no, no,' rejoined the bride; 'but all the friends, the darling friends, of my youthful days, to leave them all, it is such a shock.' With such expressions of sorrow, Miss Petowker went on to enumerate the dear friends of her youthful days, one by one, and to call upon such of them as were present to come and embrace her. This done, she remembered that Mrs. Crummles had been more than a mother to her, and after that Mr. Crummles had been more than a father to her, and after that the Master Crummleses and Miss Ninetta Crummles had been more than brothers and sisters to her. These various remembrances being each accompanied with a series of hugs, occupied a long time, and they were obliged to drive to church very fast, for fear they should be too late. The procession consisted of two flies, in the first of which were Miss Bravassa, the fourth bridesmaid, Mrs. Crummles, the collector, and Mr. Folair, who had been chosen as his second on the occasion. In the other were the bride, Mr. Crummles, Miss Snevellicci, Miss Ledrook, and the phenomenon. The costumes were beautiful. The bridesmaids were quite covered with artificial flowers, and the phenomenon in particular was rendered almost invisible by the portable arbour in which she was enshrined. Miss Ledrook, who was of a romantic turn, wore in her breast the miniature of some field officer unknown, which she had purchased, a great bargain, not very long before. The other ladies displayed several dazzling articles of imitative jewellery, almost equal to real, and Mrs. Crummles came out in a stern and gloomy majesty which attracted the admiration of all beholders. But, perhaps the appearance of Mr. Crummles was more striking and appropriate than that of any member of the party. This gentleman, who personated the bride's father, had, in pursuance of a happy and original conception, made up for the part by arraying himself in a theatrical wig of a style and pattern commonly known as a brown George, and moreover assuming a snuff-coloured suit of the previous century, with grey silk stockings and buckles to his shoes. The better to support his assumed character, he had determined to be greatly overcome, and consequently when they entered the church, the sobs of the affectionate parent were so heart-rending, that the pew opener suggested the propriety of his retiring to the vestry and comforting himself with a glass of water before the ceremony began. The procession up the aisle was beautiful. The bride, with the 4 bridesmaids, forming a group previously arranged and rehearsed; the collector, followed by his second, imitating his walk and gestures to the indescribable amusement of some theatrical friends in the gallery; Mr. Crummles, with an infirm and feeble gait; Mrs. Crummles advancing with that stage walk which consists of a stride and a stop alternately. It was the completest thing ever witnessed. The ceremony was very quickly disposed of, and all parties present having signed the register, for which purpose, when it came to his turn, Mr. Crummles carefully wiped and put on an immense pair of spectacles, they went back to breakfast in high spirits, and here they found Nicholas awaiting their arrival. 'Now then,' said Crummles, who had been assisting Mrs. Grudden in the preparation, which were on a more extensive scale than was quite agreeable to the collector, 'breakfast, breakfast.' No second invitation was required. The company crowded and squeezed themselves at the table as well as they could, and fell to immediately. Miss Petowker blushing very much when anybody was looking, and eating very much when anybody was not looking; Mr. Lillyvick going to work as though with a cool resolve that since the good things must be paid for by him, he would leave as little as possible for the Crummleses to eat up afterwards. 'It's very soon done, sir, isn't it?' inquired Mr. Folair of the collector, leaning over the table to address him. 'What is soon done, sir?' returned Mr. Lillyvick. 'The tying up, the fixing one's self with a wife,' replied Mr. Folair. 'It don't take long, does it?' 'No, sir,' replied Mr. Lillyvick, colouring. 'It does not take long. And what then, sir?' 'Oh, nothing,' said the actor. 'It don't take a man long to hang himself either, eh? Ha, ha, ha!' Mr. Lillyvick laid down his knife and fork, and looked round the table with indignant astonishment. 'To hang himself?' repeated Mr. Lillyvick. A profound silence came upon all, for Mr. Lillyvick was dignified beyond expression. 'To hang himself!' cried Mr. Lillyvick again. 'Is any parallel attempted to be drawn in this company between matrimony and hanging?' 'The noose, you know,' said Mr. Folair, a little crestfallen. 'The noose, sir!' retorted Mr. Lillyvick. 'Does any man dare to speak to me of a noose and Henrietta Lillyvick?' suggested Mr. Crummles. 'And Henrietta Lillyvick in the same breath?' said the collector. 'In this house, in the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Crummles, who have brought up a talented and virtuous family to be blessings and phenomenons, and what not? Are we to hear talk of nooses?' 'Folair,' said Mr. Crummles, deeming it a matter of decency to be affected by this allusion to himself and partner, 'I'm astonished at you.' 'What are you going on in this way at me for?' urged the unfortunate actor. 'What have I done?' 'Done, sir!' cried Mr. Lillyvick. 'Aimed a blow at the whole framework of society.' 'And the best and tenderest feelings,' added Crummles, relapsing into the old man. 'And the highest and most estimable of social ties,' said the collector. 'Noose! As if one was caught, trapped into the married state, pinned by the leg, instead of going into it of one's own accord, and glorying in the act.' 'I didn't mean to make it out that you were caught and trapped and pinned by the leg,' replied the actor. 'I'm sorry for it. I can't say any more.' 'So you ought to be, sir,' returned Mr. Lillyvick, 'and I'm glad to hear that you have enough of feeling left to be so.' The quarrel appearing to terminate with this reply, Mrs. Lillyvick considered that the fittest occasion, the attention of the company being no longer distracted, to burst into tears, and require the assistance of all 4 bridesmaids, which was immediately rendered, though not without some confusion, for the room being small and the tablecloth long, a whole detachment of plates were swept off the board at the very first move. Regardless of this circumstance, however, Mrs. Lillyvick refused to be comforted until the belligerents had passed their words that the dispute should be carried no further; which, after a sufficient show of reluctance, they did, and from that time Mr. Folair sat in moody silence, contenting himself with pinching Nicholas's leg when anything was said.